Spider-Man No Way Home is good. Really good. And it's actually a lesson for Hollywood studios out there that intend to bring back old franchises or characters from old franchises on how to do so in a respectful way that will satisfy audiences. And since I, Sean Fitzgerald of the Actual Justice Warrior, and now running a movie review channel apparently, I thought it would be impressive and amazing of me, the greatest nostalgia hater on the internet.com, to tell you why I think this movie works, despite the fact that I can't stand nostalgia. But before we get into this virtually incomprehensible position that I've taken, before you guys get attacked by my opinions, you should shield yourself with Virtual Shield transition sponsorship transition. A newly discovered security flaw seems to be one of the worst ones in the last decade. This security flaw will allow hackers, spies, criminals access to your private personal data as long as you have an internet connected device. But luckily for you, your privacy is and always has been in your own hands, and that's why I recommend Virtual Shield, because Virtual Shield is a no-log VPN, meaning they never store your search history, which for a lot of you, trust me, we never want to see your search history. Now, this month, I partnered with the creators of Virtual Shield to give you guys a 50% off discount for your lifetime subscription if you just go to virtualshield.com/justice. Again, 50% off, no log VPN. It's also got that bunch of features, like if you want to do that out of country streaming, whatever, just go to virtualshield.com/justice.
Ever since I got bit by that spider, I've only had 1 week where my life has felt normal. That was when you found out.
So I'm going to do this movie review, this discussion, this conversation between me and you and the audience, because I'm like Philip DeFranco, and this is totally not a show, it's a conversation. Just kidding. It is a show and not a conversation, with a light spoiler warning. I'm going to go over certain things that happen in the movie because it is basically impossible to have a spoiler-free discussion of this movie. But the spoilers, the light spoilers that I'm going to be going over, are so obvious that when I heard they were doing a multiverse-related Spider-Man movie, when they first announced that they were casting Alfred Molina to reprise his role as Dr. Octopus, everybody should have known they were bringing back Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield to reprise their roles as Spider-Man from their respective universes. If you weren't aware that this was going to be a thing, if you weren't sure this was going to happen, if my intro about bringing back legacy characters didn't give it away, then maybe, just maybe, you are not suited for watching content on the internet that requires any form of critical thinking. While that just got a lot more nasty than I was expecting, I apologize for that, but not really. I'm not sorry at all. Now, the reason why this movie works, in my opinion, is the same reason why other Marvel movies tend to work in this universe as compared to other franchises that are bent on nostalgia and fan service. And that reason is, and this may be my most controversial position ever put out on the internet.com, Marvel Studios, the MCU, doesn't actually do fan service. And I know that's going to shock a lot of you. I know there's going to be some angry comments down in the comments of this. But what you have to understand is when I think of fan service, I think of things like the Star Wars sequels or Jurassic World, movies that I often reference on this channel that have things or images or frames or just scenes all together that are just there for people out in the audience to look at those scenes, images, or whatever's in frame and say, I know what that is. A good example is the end of Jurassic World, where they're running through the museum and there's a hologram machine and they step on a thing, and for no reason, the dinosaur that killed Newman in the original Jurassic World, spoiler alert, actually appears in hologram form, and this serves no purpose other than to have people say, I remember that dinosaur. That's the dinosaur that killed Newman. Do you remember that dinosaur? Remember Jurassic Park? Wow, let's remember Jurassic Park. Another great example of this is Star Wars, a movie like Rogue One, where in the middle of them getting on board the planes, which are the exact same planes and hangars meant to look like the exact same hangars from the first Star Wars movie, Episode 4, you see C-3PO and R2-D2, and they're basically looking at the camera and waving like, remember C-3PO? Remember R2-D2? Or at the end end of the movie when the narrative is completely closed and you see Darth Vader kill a bunch of people just so you can have a fan service moment that doesn't suit the story. Now, I know, again, in the comments right now, it's being written, what about Avengers Endgame? They go literally back into the previous movies. Avengers Endgame is full of fan service. It's nonsensical. How dare you even assert that Marvel doesn't do fan service? But the thing is about those scenes in Avengers Endgame is that they're interwoven into the story. They're actually revisiting the past in the narrative, not just for the audience. It has some impact. I'm a big believer in that Alfred Hitchcock quote, which I don't even remember, and I probably should have looked up before I decided to reference it, that everything in the frame should serve a purpose. So even if you're going to do fan service, which doubles as a purpose for Remember This, that has to be the secondary purpose of it. When I think of fan service, I think of things that are put in the frame when that's the primary purpose to get you and the audience to say, remember this. And for the most part, Marvel doesn't do that. Avengers Endgame, they didn't do that. They're revisiting the scenes for a narrative purpose, and it has the secondary purpose of bringing back some nostalgia for the first Avengers. Now, that being said, even though Marvel in general doesn't do it, in this movie, Spider-Man No Way Home, there is a scene that qualifies as this remember this or I know what this is version of fan service, and that's the scene featuring Matthew Murdock, aka Daredevil, from the Netflix series. The only reason this guy's in the movie is so that you could say, oh my god, Marvel got the rights back to Matthew Murdock from the Netflix Daredevil series, and just in case you're really stupid and you're not aware that this guy is in fact Daredevil, there's an unnecessary scene where a brick is thrown through a window and Matthew Murdock, Daredevil from the Netflix series, captures it with his hand without even looking at it because he's blind, and you're like, wow, that guy's Daredevil. Daredevil's in the MCU. Matthew Murdock from the Netflix series Daredevil is in the MCU.
When you botched that spell where you wanted everyone to forget the Peter Parker Spider-Man, we started getting some visitors.
Now, fortunately for this movie, the other callbacks, the other references to previous Spider-Man movies do not fall in this category. They're interwoven into the story. And you may think that the story was written in such a way so that they can have these moments, but I would say that's to its credit. If you want to have these moments, you have to write the story in such a way that you can integrate the older characters. And when we're talking about the older characters, one of the things that I really appreciated, and Hollywood should take notes about why people appreciated this, is the fact that they actually took care to give most, if not all, of these legacy characters a good moment or something that allowed the fans to connect with them, that showed us that the filmmakers were thoughtful about these characters. Perfect example of this is Dr. Octopus, and yes, this is where we're going to start getting into movie spoilers, who's the first villain to show up. You seen him in the trailer, and he is pulled from the fight with Tobey Maguire near the end of Spider-Man 2, where he has Tobey Maguire by the throat in that movie. This is peak when the tentacles are infecting his brain and before Tobey Maguire is able to talk him down and get him to destroy the reactor. So at this moment, Otto Octavius is at peak crazy, and since he's pulled from that moment, Alfred Molina portrays him in that way. Since he was never talked down and never talked into destroying the reactor, he hasn't yet mentally pushed past the influence that the tentacles have over his brain, so he's really off his rocker when he's fighting Tom Holland in the beginning of this movie. This is a narrative choice that not only serves the story of this movie, but also serves the character of the previous movie in a respectful manner. And since Tom Holland's plot in this movie, or his plan in this movie, is one of the most Spider-Man plans humanly possible, which is he's going to try to cure all of these villains before he sends them back to their respective universe, Otto Octavius being peak madness before he gets cured actually really works out well to show that this plan works. It gives that false hope earlier in the movie before things all go awry, because Otto Octavius is one of the easiest people to cure. Another thing that I really liked about these movies is that the technology in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is so far ahead of anything that we've seen in either the Garfield universe or the Tobey Maguire universe, and that is reflected in this movie with how quick Tom Holland is able to replace the chip that is attached to Dr. Octopus's tentacles. And Dr. Octopus, who is never really this evil mustache twirling villain, is really appreciative of the cure that he receives. Also in this movie, they take great care and they write a narrative purpose for rehabilitating Jamie Foxx's Electro. Jamie Foxx's Electro is one of the worst modern supervillain portrayals I've seen in the last decade, and the reason why is that this guy basically has the motivation of the Riddler from Batman 3 and the look of Two-Face from Batman 4, which are two of the worst villain portrayals ever, and those are the things that killed the Batman movies up until Christopher Nolan did the reboots. So because that character sucked in Amazing Spider-Man 2, and Jamie Foxx is actually a good actor, and I don't know why you would put computer-generated blue all over the face of one of the better actors in your movie, they take time and they actually develop reasons within the narrative to change up his character a little bit. They're saying that the energy source in this different universe, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, actually reacts to his body differently because in a different universe, the electricity is going to be slightly different, yada, 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 scientific nonsense, whatever. And that allows Jamie Foxx to actually be Jamie Foxx instead of a blue combination of Mr. Freeze and the Riddler from Batman Forever. Now, I found out after viewing the film that one of the reasons why Sandman is always in sand form throughout the course of this movie is the same reason why the Lizard from Amazing Spider-Man 1 is always in lizard form. It's that these two actors actually did not want to reprise their roles in this movie. Now, narratively, as told to me by Alf Benny, friend of the channel that you should go over and subscribe to, it would have made way more sense to actually have a reason for why Sandman can't materialize in human form, much to the similar way that they had for Electro and the change in his appearance. Something about the soil composition, like the energy composition, maybe didn't allow him to materialize and use his abilities in the same exact way that he was able to use them in Spider-Man 3. Unfortunately, the movie doesn't take a lot of care in having that. However, the Sandman's motivation, way more so than the Lizard, makes a lot of sense. Because in Spider-Man 3, the Sandman was portrayed as like this not really a bad guy who just wanted to be there and do things for his daughter. So in this movie's universe, in this storyline, they actually have a way to send all of these people back to their respective universes immediately at any time that they want. And he wants to go back immediately because he knows he's not going to die and he just wants to be with his daughter. Unlike the other characters who don't want to go back immediately because they're going to die, and other characters who don't want to go back at all because they enjoy this universe. So you have conflicting motivations for the villains, but they're at least well thought out enough for most of them, probably except for the Lizard, for them to want to be villains. Now, of course, we can't talk about villains without talking about the man that absolutely steals the show and proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that he is the best Spider-Man villain. He may not be in the best Spider-Man movie, the first Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire, but he is by far the best Spider-Man villain. And of course, I am talking about William Dafoe, aka the Green Goblin, aka actually in reality the real William Dafoe, because this man, look at his face, he is a madman, he is a monster, and honestly, he was just so good in this movie. He basically stole the show from anybody that he shared a scene with, and he's actually a participant in one of my absolute favorite scenes in the entire movie. And this scene is super Spider-Man-y. There's a lot of very Spider-Man-y scenes. There's a Spider-Man fight with Doctor Strange that I really appreciated, because Spider-Man in the comic books tends to fight people that he should have no chance of winning against, but he ends up outwitting them, and that's the way that he defeats Doctor Strange in this movie. But the scene that I'm talking about is where all the villains are gathered into an apartment, and Spider-Man is working on trying to cure them individually. This is right before everything goes awry, and Spider-Man's spider sense starts going crazy, but he's surrounded by supervillains, so he has to kind of ferret out which one is the actual threat. And of course, it's Green Goblin, because he's the biggest threat.
You're struggling to have everything you want, while the world tries to make you choose.
William Dafoe basically destroys everything in Tom Holland's life, lights it on fire, and then laughs about it, and I love every second of it. I love the knockdown, drag-out fight that he has with Tom Holland's Spider-Man, how he beats the crap out of him in every conceivable way, and then he emotionally cripples him with one of the most surprising, yet necessary for this character's arc, scenes in the movie. I won't spoil that one for you, I'll leave it for you so you guys can understand it, but let's talk about what people actually want to hear about, which is the returning heroes, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. And we're going to start with the person who I think got a lot better due in this movie than the other one, and that, of course, is Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. It is no secret that Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man is not well beloved in the world, even though Andrew Garfield is an absolutely fantastic actor. Even though Andrew Garfield absolutely loved the character the most before actually playing him, as seen by this Instagram clip that has been going around of him at a Comic-Con talking about his love for Spider-Man.
Stan Lee says that the reason why Spidey is so popular is because all of us can relate to him, and I agree. I needed Spidey in my life when I was a kid, and he gave me hope. In every comic I read, he was living out mine and every skinny boy's fantasy of being stronger, of being free of the body I was born into, and that swinging sensation of flight. And upon receiving his power, unlike most who become corrupted, he used it for good. And I think we all wish that we had the courage to stick up for ourselves more, to stick up for a loved one more, or even a stranger you see being mistreated. And Peter Parker has inspired me to feel stronger. He made me, Andrew, braver. He reassured me that by doing the right thing, it's worth it. It's worth the struggle. It's worth the pain. It's worth even the tears, the bruises, and the blood. And I wouldn't be able to stand here in front of you guys right now without feeling that Spider-Man was here with me, with his reassuring hand on my shoulder, making sure I don't fall over and concuss myself. And he has inspired countless people, girls, boys, men, women, all of us. And he has saved lives, and he saved my life. And I owe Webhead a lot, and I owe Stan the Man a lot, and I'm humbled to be here like you do not know.
Setting all that aside, his movies were just not good. And the reason why his movies were not good is that the first one came out after The Dark Knight. So this was a time period where Spider-Man was being rebooted just 5 years after the previous movie, and it was being rebooted in such a way to be a copy of the Dark Knight trilogy. It was in that tone, it was darker, his eyes were smaller in the costume, meant to convey the sinister nature and the more serious nature of this movie, and it just didn't work because Spider-Man is not Batman, and you shouldn't be trying to change one of the most iconic characters, the face of Marvel, into another character just because that style of movie appeared to be trendy at the time. And then the second Amazing Spider-Man movie, which was far worse than the paint-by-numbers first one, they changed the character completely again because they wanted to basically build a Spider-Man cinematic universe in one movie. So everything was lighter, everything was brighter toned, his eyes in the costume got much bigger, and there were way too many villains in that movie. On top of that, this movie created the absolute cardinal sin in Spider-Man storytelling, and that is A, focusing on the parents, which they did in both movies, but B, and this is the most important one, making it seem like Peter Parker was predestined or the only possible one who could have been Spider-Man. That whole thing with his blood and his dad developing the spiders, therefore you can only get superpowers if you have Parker DNA, totally undercuts the premise that anyone, any kid can be Spider-Man if they're bitten by the radioactive spider and they have an uncompromising will and moral compass. It really hurt narratively Spider-Man the character, and this is a product of having Transformers and Star Trek Into Darkness writers on the staff of that second movie. By the way, Star Trek Into Darkness had magic blood from Khan, and then that carried over to this movie, which now has magic blood from Peter Parker. Also, interesting fact about the writers of these movies, they actually went on to write that Tom Cruise Mummy movie, which tried to build out a whole cinematic universe in one movie. So you have writers repeating the same mistakes over and over again, combining in Spider-Man or Amazing Spider-Man 2 to make it just awful. So really, Andrew Garfield never had a chance at being a good Spider-Man in these movies. Not to mention, the dude's like 6'3", he looks like a male model, and he doesn't really fit the Peter Parker archetype. He's just too handsome, he looks too cool early on when he's Peter Parker to be a nerd that's being bullied or whatever, and then gets the powers. So there's a lot of reasons why, despite the fact Andrew Garfield is a fantastic actor and loves the character, it just didn't work for the time period that he was in. However, in this movie, there's so much care and craft in his character, so much appreciation for his character, and so much love that they actually make moves to rehabilitate this character, and I think they very much succeed at doing so. Garfield is one of the best Spider-Man in this movie. He might actually be the best one. He might actually steal the show in terms of Spider-Man, because where he is follows so well narratively, even though those previous movies were bad. When you first see him, he's in the full costume, full mask, and they ask him for ID, and he plays it off like a joke, like he doesn't carry his ID because, you know, he's Spider-Man, and it's contradicting for him to carry his ID on him, which could be him learning a lesson from Spider-Man 1, where he had the photography camera labeled Peter Parker, and that allowed the Lizard to find him in one of the terrible writing decisions of that movie. But it's also narratively fitting because after the death of Gwen Stacy, he threw himself into the Spider-Man identity. You contrast that to Tobey Maguire, who ended up happy with Kirsten Dunst at the end of his trilogy, who shows up wearing his regular clothes with the costume underneath it. This is good characterization of Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. On top of that, there's an absolutely fantastic scene where MJ, Michelle Jones, Peter Parker's love interest in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is thrown in a way that she's going to die, similar to Gwen Stacy, by the Green Goblin, and our Peter Parker, the MCU Peter Parker, can't actually make the save. So Andrew Garfield springs into action to save her, and Garfield, who's always been a wonderful actor, plays this beautifully because his character is overwhelmed with emotion after he makes the save of Peter Parker's girlfriend that he couldn't make in his universe. He sells it great. It's amazing. It's a great moment for the character. It's honestly redeeming for the character. And it just goes to show you that even though they acknowledge that this might be the lamest of the three Spider-Men, that they actually took love and care to rehabilitate his image and make him work. And I'm happy for Andrew Garfield to have that moment, and I'm happy that there's some hype around Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. And then we have Tobey Maguire, the elder statesman of the three Spider-Men, and of course this is because Tobey Maguire was first, and he's significantly older than these two actors. And he really provides like a more mentorship role to the Tom Holland Spider-Man, a moral guide. And also, he probably should feel a little bit more guilty considering it's his Green Goblin that's running amok all over the universe more than any other villain. But that's neither here nor there. He has a good relationship with Tom Holland. He's in a better place. He actually helps to rehabilitate the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man, which I thought was really nice. And considering where we left him off and how he's still a hopeful, optimistic Spider-Man because he's been relatively successful, it's nice to see him not in a depressing hermit-like state, not wanting to participate with anybody else just because he's an older character, and that's the way that people tend to forward newer characters, by crapping on the older characters. He's still a very strong, very accomplished Spider-Man, a seasoned Spider-Man, and he represents that character from the Sam Raimi universe very well, and where he would be 10, 20 years post those movies. I really enjoyed it. It was super respectful. Tobey Maguire's face is a little weird in this movie, like he's a little bit frozen. I thought he might have had a stroke in some scenes, but overall, really good representation, a lot of care for the character, and I appreciate the fact that they didn't have to tear down these other Spider-Men in order to build Tom Holland up. That's not the approach that they went. They were respectful to the other iterations while simultaneously building Tom Holland up. Now, Tom Holland, despite the fact that there are two other more seasoned Spider-Men on the roster used to doing things alone, is unambiguously the lead of the movie. The two other Spider-Men only show up in the third act, and on top of that, Tom Holland's the only one who's worked on a team. He's worked with the Avengers. The other two have never teamed up with anybody, basically. So he's the leader in that regard as well. And it is his movie. He has the biggest emotional character arc, despite the redemption of Andrew Garfield, despite what we see from Tobey Maguire. And I think it works really well. And again, it's another way to respond to some of the fan criticisms of Tom Holland's Spider-Man. And in my opinion, I really love Tom Holland as his character. I think he's the only one who can really fit Peter Parker and Spider-Man. But that being said, I can't ignore the fact that he's essentially Iron Man Jr. And as I've watched these movies over and over again, I have become more hateful of the suits that he's wearing because they're basically Iron Man suits. The Iron Spider suit, I cannot stand it. I just want it gone from these movies, period, point blank. And going into this movie, I didn't think I was going to get that as my wish, but I totally did. We see Tom Holland go through it. We see him lose somebody. We see him get torn down. And then we see him make the noble sacrifice not once, but twice at the end of the movie. Now, after the first one, you could kind of see the second one coming, but I really appreciate that they added that level of depth in the character. And you really took everything away from the Marvel Cinematic Universe from this Spider-Man. He builds his own costume and he has to go out on his own. There's actual consequences and weight to the events of this movie, and I really appreciate that. The only thing throughout this entire movie that I didn't really care for all that much was J. Jonah Jameson, which is unfortunate because J.K. Simmons is basically born to play that character, and that's because in the last movie, they made it seem like J. Jonah Jameson was like a cable TV host, which is something that they'd done in the comics before, but in this one, for some odd reason, they basically turned him into Alex Jones, and I didn't really need that close to a political allegory in my movie. But that being said, for this movie overall, there weren't really any divisive Spider-Man politics within this movie. There was like one comment from Jamie Foxx about why he was such a big fan of Spider-Man from Amazing Spider-Man 2, and that's because he thought he was a black dude, which, by the way, you might think is political, you might think it's whatever, but honestly, there's a great Spider-Man comic book about a kid that looks up to Spider-Man, and then he finds out he's white, and he's actually upset, and the whole idea of that is that people can project whatever they want onto the suit, because everything is covered by the suit. It's a really cool idea. It's not really mentioned all but that one time in the movie. But yeah, I would recommend actually reading that comic book before you judge that statement and say the whole movie's bad because of that one supposedly woke statement. It's really not in here. They just left all the politics out. It's almost like this movie was made in the style or in the script from 10 years ago, original Marvel, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. I mean, how easy would it have been to say that these three white men, Spider-Man, straight white men, are the heroes? That's totally ridiculous. That wasn't in the movie, and we should all be grateful. But hey, those are just my thoughts about this movie. If you've seen it, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you want to see it, also let me know down in the comments below. If you hate it, I don't even the comments below. That's what people gotta ask for. They gotta ask for comments on YouTube. If you like this video, you can show them by leaving a like. You can subscribe for more content. Follow me on all my social medias. You can support me via the support links in the description box. This has been me talking about the topic of the video that I even talked about. Till next time.